Right. I am Sara Pantuliano. I'm one of the managing directors at ODI, and I'm delighted to be chairing this panel on contemporary armed conflict and the laws of war. Now, armed conflict and the laws of war was one of the areas of greatest concern and interest for the Commission. And the Commission was particularly seized with what it saw as some disturbing trends that needed to be addressed. And it identified four in particular. The first was the development and the proliferation of lethal weapons of mass destruction. The second was the alarming rise in the expenditure by states on their armed forces. The third was the proliferation of armed conflicts and proxy wars at national and regional level. And last was the spread of what it called vicious communal conflicts, in which people are targeted for ethnic, religious, or other identity. And we're talking of 85, not that much has changed. So the Commission set out to try and identify ways to revitalize IHL and give some greater authority to its norms, because it felt it was fundamental to try and do something to better humanize wars, as he put it. And there's some really interesting and still very relevant analysis that the Commission produced. And it identified a number of recommendations, and I think there are 3 or 4 that stand out that I just put to you. So the first was the idea of creating a very small, clear, concise restatement of the fundamental rules, a sort of code of conduct that could help people understand better, what rules should govern the conduct of war. The Commission was concerned that IHL was too confused, ambiguous. It didn't make it easy for belligerent states and non-states to really understand what they could or could not do and how. The second was, to increase the use of good offices and commissions of inquiry. Again, he felt it was really important to put pressure on the parties to a conflict. And the third was to increase vigilance during states of emergency, not necessarily a full-blown armed conflict, but as states showed sign of becoming embroiled in conflict, or local situations, not just states, that countries should be put on a list, that should be put under observance, so that the international community of states could help with their good offices or with some pressure through commissions of inquiry to increase public awareness of these situations. And the fourth was really around public awareness. The Commission felt it was fundamental to really, as we heard from Mark this morning, that perhaps shaming, public pressure was the critical tool to try and bring some of the worst effects, the worst impacts of conflict mitigated. And so increased public opinion and media exposure was what the Commission was really recommending. And there were a number of others, particularly around communal conflict, that the Commission developed. So to discuss the work of the Commission in this respect, these kind of recommendations, I've got a great panel with me of colleagues who have dealt with these issues for a very long time. So to my right is Emanuela-Chiara Gillard, who is a senior research fellow at Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. Lina, Khatib, who is the head of the MENA program here at Chatham House. To my immediate left, Antonio Donini, who is a visiting fellow at the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University. And last but not least, Norah Niland, who is at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. So let me start by asking Antonio, actually, what can we learn from the work of the Commission? How much of it is still relevant today?
Thank you, Sara, and thank you to the organizers, to Martin, to Mark, to Zia's family for bringing us all here together. And it's great to see some old friends I hadn't seen in a long, long time. I have to explain that, as many other people in this room, I owe my career, in a sense, to Sadruddin and to Zia, because one of the recommendations in the Commission was the establishment of an independent coordination body inside the UN that would coordinate humanitarian action, which then became OCHA. But even before OCHA was established, I joined what was then called the UN Coordination Office for Humanitarian and Economic Assistance Programs for Afghanistan. The acronym UNCHIPA didn't last very long. But in many ways, Martin was my boss in Islamabad, and before that, I was in Geneva for a year with Sadruddin and Zia were daily, were in daily meetings all together. And for me, it was a huge insight into the functioning of the international system. And Mark mentioned the battery of the Commission still running. For me, it was a laboratory. I think that many ideas were created in the Commission that then were translated into real-life humanitarian situations, in particular, in my case, Afghanistan. And I think the contribution of Zia and Sadruddin to Afghanistan was, in particular, the establishment of an independent office that was not linked to a particular agency. In the past, there had been offices, coordination offices, under the lead agency concept, but I think Sadruddin's vision there was important. He obtained from the Secretary General that after the Geneva Accords, which was supposed to bring already in 1988 peace to Afghanistan, there needed to be an interagency office that would represent the UN as a whole rather than just an office attached to a specific agency. And that office had various incarnations. It was called Operation Salam. It even had its own flag, much to the irritation of the people who deal with flags in the UN, because it was a white flag with a green logo that looked a bit like, in Islamic script. And Operation Salam then spawned a number of other interesting concepts. In particular, and this is important for us today, the first thing that Sadruddin and Zia were working very closely together on this, the first thing that they did was to negotiate a humanitarian consensus with all the parties to the conflict in Afghanistan, which meant that Sadruddin went to all the neighboring countries, to Kabul, to Pakistan, to Iran, to the Soviet Union, and met with the Americans as well, and obtained from them and from all the parties inside the country the so-called interim government of 11 factions, but there were many other factions that not made perhaps as many as 1,000 as you have in Syria today, but it was a kind of a messy environment. So he negotiated with all the parties to the conflict the idea that the UN would be allowed to work cross-line and cross-border from wherever it made more sense to work from. And this had two important effects. One, it established the UN as a honest, relatively neutral broker. And two, it sanitized, it helped to clear up the mess that was going on from the Pakistan side in particular, where you had a myriad of NGOs, many of them created around the Afghan conflict, the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan, Afghan-Aid, and many other small NGOs that were NGOs that were working cross-border into the Mujahideen-held areas, which today seems to us a bit, they were not particularly humanitarian NGOs. They were providing some relief, but they had clearly taken sides. And they were very critical of the UN because the UN had maintained a presence in Kabul. So there was the good UN that was based in Pakistan, dealing with refugee issues, and the bad UN in Kabul. And we find exactly the same thing today in Syria. I'm sure we'll talk about that. So the idea, the combination of this idea of a humanitarian consensus that all parties had agreed to, and the humanitarian encirclement, these are Zia's terms, of that we would work from around the country, was a very important innovation that people in this room, Alan Jones, Ramesh, and of course Martin, we were all involved in this. We broke new ground. And what was interesting was the fact that the NGOs initially thought that the UN was completely off beam and that we should have been working cross-border from Pakistan. But then bit by bit, the situation changed, and some of the more reputable NGOs, including Oxfam, for example, decided to open offices in Kabul, which was still held by the Najibullah regime. So it managed to, the role of the UN in those days managed to, negotiate access in a way that was relatively effective. It was not perfect. There was always attempts by large and small players to instrumentalize what was going on the ground. But by and large, we did manage to clear up the situation to a large extent. And the creativity of Zia also led to such things as a Salam Express that came across the then Soviet Union to the Afghan border to deliver food. We had Salam mobile units, which were actually not mobile, but they were bases inside the country around which activities were being developed. In particular, the very important innovation in Afghanistan, which thanks to Zia and Martin, we had the first real humanitarian mine action program that was ever established, which was totally Afghanized in the sense that we created, Martin created, Afghan NGOs, that were dedicated NGOs that were working only for this program. And that, I think, broke new ground and also managed to show visually to the people on the ground that the UN was serious about trying to deal with some of the consequences of the war. Should I stop? Just one thing. One thing that was interesting is that perhaps because it was the Cold War, there were clearly clearer boundaries in what was possible and what was not possible. To some extent, we were pushing these boundaries, and the innovation was that the Soviets got engaged. For the first time, they made a pledge at the conference on the Consolidated Appeal for Afghanistan. They pledged something like 600 million rubles of stuff, including galoshes, powdered eggs, but also stuff that Ramesh remembers we could monetize, like sugar, that we would sell to monetize to develop a small-scale project inside the country. So there were these borders, and what was interesting, I think, was that unlike the trend today, where more and more the UN is telling us that we're all in the same boat and that the humanitarian development and peace and security people and the human rights need to work together, in those years in Afghanistan, there was a relatively clear separation between what was humanitarian and the political process that was kept separate, at least initially, while Sadruddin was still the UN coordinator.
I'll come back to you afterwards, but Norah, I want to ask you, do you think a humanitarian consensus in Afghanistan would work today? Would it deliver what it delivered at the time?
Would a humanitarian consensus work in today's Afghanistan?
Yeah.
Well, actually, as in all war situations, there are different realities. I was there a few months ago, and one of the concerning features, whereas there's still a lot of effort and good work being achieved through achieving the ability, what's called humanitarian space, to visit different parts of the country. For the first time, there was evidence where the government had taken a stance in blocking support to a particular neighborhood where Daesh, or folk calling themselves Daesh, were present. Because the war in Afghanistan, unfortunately, has gone on for so long, I think what is possible today also benefits from what was done in Zia's time and Prince Sadruddin's time, and that's clearly important. Some of the other things that happened, I worked with Zia just for a year at the commission. This is in the mid-'80s, and it was an inspiring period for me. I was a much younger person then, and went from the commission to work on the Thai-Cambodian border. But what I want to talk about, since it's about Afghanistan, one of the things I learned, of course, was about the extent to which the rules of war are quite often, and as we see these days, unfortunately, quite widely and deeply not respected. And that was something that the Commission spent some time on. And more recently, when I've been working in Afghanistan, I went back in 2008. I've worked there a few times. And what we were able to do, Mr. Lowcock made reference to it this morning. He talked about NATO, but actually before NATO, the UN, we generated an initiative to document incidents involving reported civilian casualties, and then using that evidence to work with all the warring parties. We were equidistant, both from those supporting the government, which was NATO, but also those opposed to the government. But then using that evidence, both in private and in public, to try to secure compliance with basic norms. And that has worked, it continues to work. And it worked to the extent that the Taliban, for example, introduced fatwas to reduce the use of IEDs in areas where people were concentrated. We were focusing, for example, at markets and in schools. and NATO introduced tactical directives to reduce the use of airstrikes. So the point here is that we're talking about the legacy of the Commission. I think some of the ideas that were of concern then, that we've been able to build subsequently on the shoulders of these initiatives. I mean, the other one I should mention very quickly, since I'm based in Geneva, is ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. As we know, the treaty was adopted a few weeks ago, and in another few weeks, ICAN, which is less than 10 years old, so of course it hasn't achieved all of that as the point in 10 years, it's built on what went before it, but it's going to receive, and I think rightly so, the Nobel Peace Prize in Scandinavia.
Thanks. Afghanistan has clearly been a very important humanitarian laboratory, thanks to the work of the and the Commission, amongst others. More recently, of course, Syria has become the new humanitarian laboratory. Lina, what have we learned from the conduct of humanitarian operations in Syria?
We have learned a lot, and sadly what I'll talk about is all about challenges, really. We have learned that there are many challenges. One of them has to do with the method of war itself that is being used in Syria, which is basically, when it comes to the regime in particular, a method based on the use of sieges and starvation as a tool of war. And this makes the Syrian conflict stand out from, for example, the case of Afghanistan. And we are also seeing the deliberate targeting of hospitals, for example, and clinics. So there is a deliberate attempt at derailing humanitarian assistance, mainly by the regime side. The other thing that we are learning from Syria is the issue of how humanitarian aid is instrumentalized by actors on the ground. When it comes to the regime, for example, we are seeing, unfortunately, money meant for humanitarian assistance being funneled through state institutions in Syria in order to actually be then sent to militias on the ground that are fighting alongside the regime. And this is happening because the militias are setting up charities and NGOs, and these NGOs are getting funding from ministries such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Syria. The ministry itself handles money coming from the international community meant for humanitarian aid. So the money ends up actually funding the war rather than making the situation better. The other issue is non-state actors themselves are also instrumentalizing this issue, even on the non-regime side. So right now, for example, we have the liberation of areas from ISIS going on. And unfortunately, some of the groups involved in this liberation are acting in ways that are not ethical. They are blocking humanitarian aid from reaching communities in the areas that they themselves have liberated from ISIS. And this is not unique to Syria. We saw a similar situation in Iraq post the liberation from ISIS of areas like Ramadi and Mosul. The militias that participated in this campaign, not all of them, but some of them, set up, for example, what they called screening camps, meant for, they said, screening the people coming out of these areas in order to find out who is with ISIS and who is not. But actually, they ended up using these camps to settle political scores and prevented humanitarian agencies from accessing them. And the humanitarian agencies that I spoke to about this case were very frustrated because they didn't know what the leadership structure with these militias were like, so that they could find out who they can talk to get access. So the situation was lacking in transparency. And this leads me to my next point, which is about response. In Syria, we have had some incidents of food drops by the international community in certain places, but sadly, the Russian military intervention has prevented food drops from actually being used in areas like Deir ez-Zor, where people ended up with very little access to medicine and to food because it was just impossible for the international anti-ISIS coalition, for example, to use its own airplanes to help with processes like that. The other issue is the regime itself. And here we, again, talking about another challenge when it comes to response, the Syrian regime itself systematically blocking access to humanitarian aid when it comes to areas that were rebel controlled. This is a problem that many humanitarian agencies that operate in Syria have documented and spoke about. And anyone who's following the political process will also know that the issue of access to humanitarian aid has been one of the key demands of the Syrian opposition in the Geneva process. The other issue that must be flagged when it comes to the issue of Syria is sometimes there are intervening factors, such as the issue of Syrian refugees in places outside Syria, for example, Lebanon. Lebanon in particular is unfortunately one of the most corrupt states in the world, as well documented by several corruption indexes. And the refugee situation is very much part of this, in that money coming in for humanitarian assistance and development for host communities, as well as the refugee community coming from Syria there, is very often pocketed by all kinds of corrupt entities, some of them from the Lebanese political sphere, some of them in the Lebanese government itself. So you have that basically happening. So the issue of Syria when it comes to the method of war, the responses, the instrumentalization, these intervening factors, all kinds of challenges. But at the level of policy, I will end with two things. I spoke quite a lot myself to the independent inquiry of Commission on Syria set up by the UN. And they did really, really great work in talking to so many actors on the ground in order to find out what is actually happening. But sadly, their many reports did not really lead to a change in policy internationally. Sadly, it did not lead to much. And this makes me feel rather frustrated that when good work is being undertaken, it's not necessarily translating into a change in policy. The other issue I will end with is that right now there is a big concern that I have and many other people like me who study Syria closely have about Idlib in particular, because in that area there's a significant presence for the Al-Qaeda affiliated group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that used to be known as Jabhat Fath al-Sham, before that Jabhat al-Nusra. Because it's the most significant military actor in that area, there's this assumption that this group controls all aspects of life in Idlib, and that if you send any humanitarian aid or aid to NGOs in that governorate, then it's going to end up in the wrong hands. The reality is actually very different. It is the people in Idlib who are resisting the control of this group that have limited the control of this group to military control only, not administrative control, not governance control, not social control. There's a lot of resistance. And for civil society and local councils and just the people of Idlib to continue resisting, the international community must continue to give them assistance and aid. So there is this erroneous assumption, and I'm not going to name which government I was talking to in Europe that has this idea, that if aid is stopped to Idlib, then this Al-Qaeda group will be forced to fill the gap itself, and it doesn't have the capacity to do so, and then people will rise against it. This is completely erroneous. The dynamic on the ground, as I said, is very different. So no matter what, I think we have to find ways in order to support the delivery of humanitarian aid across Syria, no matter if it's regime, non-regime, no matter if there is Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Ultimately, we are talking about people. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina. Yeah, a very sobering account of the challenges of delivering humanitarian aid in Syria. Manu, you are one of the people I admire the most in their ability to elucidate the tenets of IHL. And one thing that gets talked about in every context, in every armed conflict when we're trying to negotiate the delivery of humanitarian aid is humanitarian imperative and its status in IHL. Can you demystify it for all of us once and for all?
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here today. And thank you for giving me this opportunity, hopefully, to put an end to this mythical notion of the humanitarian imperative. I've been watching it being bandied about with immense frustration. It's incorrect, and I think it's misleading and dangerous. It's incorrect as a matter of international law. The term's used in a way that suggests that somehow, in severe circumstances, it is possible to hit this magic humanitarian imperative button, and all constraints that we've faced, military, political, or otherwise, somehow have to fall aside. Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, that is just simply not the case. There is no notion of humanitarian imperative in international humanitarian law or in any other body of law. The rules of IHL throughout are a careful balancing of consideration of humanity, so if you want the humanitarian imperative, and military consideration. In the same way that it is impossible to inject additional military considerations into the law to say, yes, the law says I must not attack civilians, but imperative military necessity entitles me to do so. For exactly the same reasons, it's not possible to suspend the rules and then say, aha, humanitarian imperative. That's just not how the system works. So this expression is incorrect as a matter of law. I also think it's misleading and dangerous for us to invoke it, to think it exists as a matter of humanitarian diplomacy, for want of a better term. It lulls us into a false sense of security. If things get really bad, I can invoke this concept. There is no such possibility, unfortunately. What does this mean? That we need to fight for and negotiate for what we want to achieve for humanitarian purposes, step by step. Sorry.
Great. No, that's perfect. I mean, part of my frustration is I find a lot of the frontline humanitarian workers are just not trained in IHL. And I think that is one of the biggest problems we have. So there is such an incorrect use of language because, unfortunately, the organizations that deploy colleagues don't invest in their capacity to be able to negotiate with belligerents. And I think that's what lands us in a lot of difficulties. I have a lot of questions to ask, but I'm also wondering whether, I see an eager audience, whether we should actually open it to the floor. And I'll add some of my questions to the questions that may come from the floor, because we've got just 25 minutes if you want to stick to time. So let me open it to the floor at this point. And if you take the floor, say who you are, if you are affiliated to any organization, and if your comment or question is directed to any particular colleague. Helen. There's a microphone there.
Who my question or my comment is aimed at. But basically, I think what we're also seeing very much on the ground, and your examples of Syria really show that, is that we're having to negotiate, or to use a term that's used a lot as well, make deals to provide assistance, to provide protection, to evacuate, in the sense that, you can evacuate so many people from this place, but only if exactly the same number are evacuated from another place. Provision of aid is the same thing. So there are situations where we find ourselves actually negotiating things we should never be negotiating. And this, I think, is a huge threat to the fundamental principles of impartiality, of neutrality, and has the potential to reduce, in fact, the humanitarian space in which we're living. And so I'd just be interested to, if anybody would like to volunteer in the panel, comments around how to tackle this from a political point of view. Thank you.
Let me take a couple before I come back to the panel. Is there no one yet? How do we tackle it politically, Antonio? You've been doing a lot of thinking on.
Well, I want to react to something that Emanuela said, that I think she's right in terms of law. But I think it was Prince Hassan who mentioned the law of peace. And there's always been this tension in the UN between, saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war and humanizing war. And the humanizing war part, it seems to me, is not working very well. And that shouldn't we be doing something about that? I mean, Peter Maurer is on record as having said that, the president of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, he said, we're in pre-Solferino times. So, in a sense, he's saying that the law is not sufficient or doesn't work or needs to be changed. Well, that's what I heard him say.
Correction from the ICRC. But then, so one thing we've been discussing a lot is perhaps, one thing that is also missing these days is, some of the, if you want, great inspired humanitarian leadership that we have seen at the time of the Commission. Would that, take us somewhere in terms of, pushing beyond the pre-Solferino times if something like that does really?
Well, I think that we don't have, with some exceptions, but in the 90s, somehow great leaders emerged. Jim Grant negotiating the OLS, Operation Life Science Sudan. Sadruddin managing to get all the parties, the Soviets and the Americans and all the parties in the conflict to agree on the basic space for the UN to operate. Why don't we have this kind of success today? I think partly because we live in a much more complicated world, and the ability of the system to negotiate with people who are not like-minded or who basically denounce the way in which we operate or the values that we have makes it much more difficult. I don't have an answer. Where is Jim Grant when we need him? But or Sadruddin or Zia. Maybe there's something also wrong with the way in which the system has evolved. It's become increasingly proceduralized, institutionalized. I can add some more I's, professionalized. And it's lost some of the flexibility that it had 30 years ago when, and the fact also that on the ground, the agency of the individual aid worker is much less than what it used to be because of modern communications, because you can't move out of the wire without having all sorts of security arrangements in place, et cetera, et cetera. I think things, the enterprise is much bigger. It saves more lives, perhaps, but it's also lost some of its can-do capacity.
Manu, do you agree with Antonio's assessment? I mean, we heard from Mark this morning that there's never been a golden age in compliance, but I think some of what Antonio says also resonates with the challenges, additional challenges that we see today.
Absolutely, and I was nodding in agreement with everything he said, even though he said he was disagreeing with me. I was nodding in agreement in terms of the challenges, and in fact, I wanted to pick up on the point that Helen of the ICRC made about negotiation, not so much from a political point of view, but just in terms of, I think it's fundamental for people to understand the legal framework. But the law is not a legal silver bullet to resolve your problems, and it was something that we saw very much in relation to Syria. There was a desire to somehow frame the legal question that would give you the answer that you wanted and therefore mean that you would not need to go through painful negotiations. So when Antonio was telling me about the Afghanistan example and finding the consensus with all neighboring states, I was saying that was exactly the kind of exercise that was necessary, not now, but in 2012, to engage with all the parties through a painful process of step-by-step negotiation and building confidence. Well, I feel that, at least in relation to Syria, we've been both extremely bullish. We want everything now. All of us have access across the board for all kinds of activities now, which led to this unprecedented involvement of the Security Council actually imposing operations, which might come back to haunt us in other contexts, because you might very well have situations where states are going to say, unless and until the Security Council authorizes operations, you're not coming here. I hope that's not going to be the case. And at the same time, we've also been very self-censoring in terms of actually taking advantage of what we have. The arrangement for cross-borders operations by notification only are exactly the same as for cross-line by notification only. They've never been taken, made use of. So we're at a stage where we're both incredibly bullish and have this desire to avoid having to go through the painful process of negotiation, and also extremely self-restrained. And the compromises that we have agreed to in Syria, the systematic removal of medical items from convoys, this is the foundations of humanitarian action and IHL. And we've let down the people of Syria, but this is also, Cassandra, this is going to haunt us well beyond Syria.
Absolutely. Lina, I'd like to hear from you, because I've been working over the last few years with a lot of these nascent humanitarian organizations that have sprung out in Syria, some of which actually focus on the medical assistance, have been absolutely mystified by what international organizations have agreed to. I'm sure you've been working with them too. What's your assessment?
Well, the assessment is that a lot of them had to radically change their methods of operation in order to, for example, with medical assistance in particular, in order to continue delivering medicines inside Syria. So, for example, 2 years ago, I was talking to Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, who said that at that time, 70% of all medicine going to northern Syria came from them. And they had to close down all their hospitals inside northern Syria because 5 of their doctors had been kidnapped by ISIS, and they had to just basically get out of the country. And they had a dilemma, a real one, because it's an organization built on the method of being present on the ground in areas of conflict and constructing a hospital in 72 hours. And all of a sudden, they found themselves having to construct a whole new model of operation based on remote assistance that's cross-border, cooperating with local actors on the ground. And that involved a huge managerial dilemma for them that they eventually kind of resolved through, as I said, creating a new model. And so what we're seeing is these humanitarian agencies having to innovate in a way that they never had to do before, because the kinds of challenges that they are facing, again, are very different. I also know from them that 2 incidents happened in Afghanistan and Syria in which one of their hospitals in one of these countries was targeted by the regime and its allies in one incident in Syria, and by, as it happened, the anti-ISIS coalition in the attack on Afghanistan in another case. Both presented as collateral damage, but they said that they send their coordinates whenever they set up a hospital or whenever a clinic, works with them. They send the coordinates. So again, it becomes very murky. The situation that we are dealing with, despite the transparency and the new models, we are still seeing what I see as sidelining humanity, basically, for the pursuit of political goals.
Let me go back to the floor. Princess San wants to come in, and then Yasmin.
I was struck by the remark humanitarian consensus in Afghanistan, and I mentioned earlier that the Military Staff Committee of the Security Council never meets. I also wanted to add that General Ricky, a great peacemaker, in fact one of the founders of the whole peacekeeping exercise, with soldiers in different parts of the world. We had 15,000 soldiers in the Balkans during the time. Wanted to create a staff college specifically for blue overalls, not only for blue helmets. And I would like to suggest that when I went with Yossi Sarid, the Israeli minister, in 1994, we had the chutzpah to say peace in the Middle East, peace to the Balkans. We had just signed the peace agreement. And the extraordinary thing was that we were well received by the professional soldiers on the ground of the different nationalities, by obviously the recipients of the aid. The Israelis and the Jordanians deployed together very professionally. But the warring heads, well aware of the fact, I mean, the most extraordinary press conference of my life was the Serb, the Croat, the Bosnian Muslim, myself and the Israeli, and I was supposed to get them to talk, and nobody wanted to talk to anybody else. But But the point was very clear that the Mujahideen were coming in with a nod from the White House at that time. So nobody actually wanted to talk about the humanitarian consensus. How can you freeze a humanitarian consensus in time when outside players are doing exactly what they're doing in Syria the whole time? So, I mean, if this day's conversation is going to lead somewhere, future structural, suggestions, recommendations that might be taken seriously, I just want to dwell on that nexus between security concerns, development concerns, and humanitarian concerns. Maybe the issue of Idlib would be somehow resolved if people were more aware of what you just said.
Thank you. Yasmin at the back.
Thank you very much. It's nice to see old friends here, especially Norah and Antonio and Martin and everyone. My name is Yasmin Sharif, and I'm the Director of Education Cannot Wait. Came out of the World Humanitarian Summit under the UN Special Envoy for Education. And I'll come back to education, because I think it's relevant here. And also had the privilege to work with Zia Rizvi and Donini. I came to IBHI in '88 and then joined Operation Salam. So it's a long way. Now, when it comes to humanitarian law and human rights law, and I'm a lawyer in that area, I really come to the conclusion over the years that the law alone is not going to change the world. As much as we respect and admire the legal framework, it will not change the world. It is important, of course, to address impunity. We have developed a rather sophisticated system that doesn't always upheld. But I think that the Prince Hassan mentioned something very important, which I also think echoes Zia Rizvi's and Donini Khan's thinking back then, is we have to look at issues of morality and ethical issues. That's where it goes back. International law is rooted in that. And Zia Rizvi, being someone searching for the root causes, it does go back to education. And it's not just academic education, it's how we educate the children. Ethics and values and morals. And if we really want to be serious about getting that humanity back, it also starts investing in education in crisis-affected countries. And also in the more well-off parts of the world, because that's where many of the political decisions are made, focusing on ethics and values more than the legal framework. And I want to tell a story about Afghanistan. There was one of the Mujahideens there during the war, during the USSR, the Soviets, when they invaded Afghanistan. There was a Sufi Mujahideen called Pir Gilyani. I'm sure you remember him, some of them. And he was known, as opposed to the other warring factions, but both on the USSR side and on the Mujahideen side, he was actually known to treat his prisoners of war according to the Fourth Geneva Convention, the third Geneva Convention, prisoners of wars, by giving them access to books, no torturing, treating them humanely. And a friend of mine, when I was working in Afghanistan, his name was Hamid, he used to serve with Pir Gilyani against the Soviets. So when he was telling the story about Pir Gilyani and how he was treating prisoners of war, I say, wow, that means that your commander really knew the IHL. And he said, no, it was his humanity. And I would appeal to anyone in the field of humanitarianism that we would invest more in the research of accessing that humanity and to use education as a tool for that. And I'm sure that that's something that also Zia Rizvi would have agreed to, and Prince Aga Khan. All of us here. I think that's where we are going. Thank you.
Thanks, Yasmin. Go, question or comment here?
Thanks, Melanie Ward from the International Rescue Committee. Following on from that, I was interested in what the panel thinks should be done about the current situation with IHL. Any ideas moving forward? Mark Lowcock gave a few this morning. And I was interested to see in the recently released DFID humanitarian reform policy, one of their ideas about what could be done to try and encourage IHL to be upheld more widely is to encourage other countries to put elements of IHL into national legislation. On the one hand, I think it's great that they're coming up with ideas. On the other hand, the governments and parties that are the problem are hardly likely to adopt this into national legislation. We've asked a bit about what the plan is to take that forward, and it's not totally clear what the answer is. But again, good that they're coming up with suggestions. So I was interested in what you might think about that and what ideas you might have.
Norah, can I come to you, both to respond to the comments that Princess San and Yasmin have made, and to Mandy's question?
Two very good questions and observations. And of course, I would never disagree with Yasmin, and totally agree with the importance of education. I guess what I would add, looking at where we were 30 years ago and where we are now, and we all know we live in these very turbulent times and also somewhat contradictory times. I mean, more of us are clued in and aware of actually what's going on in Yemen, Syria, what happened during the end days of the war in Sri Lanka. And then if we look at, and it came out last year, People on War, this survey done of something like 17,000 people by the International Committee of the Red Cross. And actually, the majority of war affected, but also the survey included the 5 countries in Switzerland. And it's actually quite alarming, the number of people in the P5 countries, as well as Switzerland, who, for example, agree with torture, or who, the majority disagree with it, but it's quite high numbers, like 30 to 40% in some places. So there's quite a divergence, of course. Maybe this shouldn't be a total surprise to me or maybe to others, that the way in which war-affected communities relate to the regulations that are there and should be honored in wartime, and the way the rest of us are quite indifferent. I mean, I have to say, looking at all the different war zones and looking at the extent to which Europe, the investment in keeping people out, the investment in blocking the right to seek asylum. So I myself put atrocity and the right to seek asylum together, because quite often most wars are happening outside the shores of Europe, etc. So in terms of colleagues from IRC, moving forward, what to do, I think we're going to have to harness, first of all, challenge the indifference of all of us, because that's what it is, to atrocity and the repercussions of it, and then the inability of many people not to be able to seek asylum. Of course, people coming out of Syria, the vast majority are in the region. I think going forward, there has to be some kind of effort to mobilize citizens. We were discussing a little bit last night how in 2015, I spent a short while in Lesbos, people coming off rubber dinghies. And at that point in Europe, and it has persisted, there's lots of small initiatives, lots of small effort. But partly it seems to me, it would be good if I'm wrong on this, that because we've become so institutionalized in formal humanitarian business, that we're unable to capture or to support these smaller initiatives. I mean, I live in a little village just outside Geneva where we have 50, the numbers have gone down, but a few months ago, 50 Afghans living in the local nuclear bunker. And we now do have a small group not to supplant, of course, what the Swiss authorities are doing reasonably well, but basically to open up a dialogue or communication, a relationship between those people they're all young men seeking asylum, and the local community. So my point is, to answer the 2 questions, I think going forward we have to mobilize our concern about this. And so for me, given the blockages in the Security Council, I would argue for a citizens' campaign. We've got good examples from the Landmines Treaty and the recent campaign to ban nuclear weapons. And yeah, I think challenge our indifference in this world where we are secure, et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks. That's a practical idea to take forward. And I think, in the last 5 minutes, that's where we want to go. Princess Anne has encouraged us to think, what can really constructively come out of this conversation today. Antonio, what would you add to Norah's suggestion?
I agree with Norah, of course. I was struck. I wouldn't dare to disagree. I was struck by Mr. Lowcock because he at the end of his speech, he said outrage. And I thought, okay, then maybe he's going to say something about what we should do to be outraged. But he didn't. He said, things don't look so bad in the end, and we can make progress here and there. And I think that's the wrong assessment. I think that given what we know about the current state of the wars and the displacement and the fact that Fortress Europe is raising its barriers and externalizing the issues to the other side of the Mediterranean, I think, where is our morality if we accept this? I mean, I'm old enough to remember the mobilization during the Vietnam War. And there were mass protests all over the world. Okay, in the US there was the draft, so people felt it as a direct threat. But you had this mass mobilization. You had the Russell tribunals. You had there was a sense that an enthusiasm to try to change things, and we don't have that now. And I think we have to find a way of regenerating it.
Thanks. Lina, your thoughts? What can we offer as a practical suggestion? We've heard a lot about morality, mobilizing the public.
I think the public is not mobilizing enough. My concern is, sadly, that especially when it comes to the Middle East, conflicts seem to have become routinized and normalized so that people just look at them as something that is natural in that area of the world. And this is sadly something that becomes episodic, this sense of outrage or moral panic, such as when the picture of that baby who was dead on the shore came up. It was a very small media storm that died out, didn't lead to change in policy. I think we can all do something through, even at the very local level, even at lobbying members of parliament, even at trying to do something with local NGOs. All these actions matter. And this is the other thing, that sometimes also people think of these conflicts as being so big that they feel completely weak and irrelevant. And it's not the case.
Thanks. So, Manu, do you want to put a plea for the law? Because we're hearing law is not a silver bullet, law is not going to solve it. But is there anything the law actually can do?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, first is let's give the law its due. And the ICRC is engaged in a very interesting project at the moment. I had the name before. It actually identifies instances in which the law was complied with. And it's a bit of a media non-event. No one was bombed. But I think it's very important, both in terms of how we perceived IHL. It's not just a body of law that's routinely violated. No, it is systematically complied with very frequently. It's just not a media story. And it's also important for us to analyze compliance to see what led to compliance. So first, let's also look at the positive. And then, obviously, law has its role. It's, in terms of access, it's the background against which we negotiate. In terms of actual conduct of hostilities, it's what parties must comply with. I think, just to tie up the various strands, I think education is fundamental, and maybe it's education and awareness raising of the law at all levels. My daughter, I was telling you earlier, is 6 years old. I had to go and tell them what I did. And I told 6-year-olds about international humanitarian law. They love it. Seriously, and they really get it. They ask you, when you're coming back. So at all levels, from primary school, universities, society, the media, and it's a really interesting topic. Everyone should be more aware. And then something that struck me reading the report, it was interesting. 1986, at one point, one of the comments was, now is not a good time politically to try and advance the law. And I went, wow, wait a moment. That's what I've heard all my professional life. Now is not a good time politically to change the law. As if sometimes there was a golden moment. Obviously, there isn't. And we need to be strategic about choosing the right topic at the right moment. And one example, for example, is cluster munitions. I found it amazing. It's 2006, widespread use in southern Lebanon. 2009, we have a convention. So that was really being strategic, choosing the moment, choosing the topic. And I think that's what we need to do in going ahead. How do you eat an elephant? A bite at the time. Trying to address the whole of IHL is just too ambitious. Let's choose the right topic, be it in terms of developing the law or finding a mechanism to facilitate compliance with it.
Excellent. Well, thanks. I think what I take is 3 main things that we can try and do. You want to add something?
No, it's after you.
I'm trying to stick to time, and I'm under Mark's watchful eye here. So, but yeah, I think I would take away three key things from these discussions about what can we do living today. And the first clearly is, challenge the indifference, sort of build this sense of outrage, mobilize the public. A lot of us can do it in the organizations in which we work, but I think sometimes we're not very good at doing it together in a way that is, coherent, structured, and can really advance messages that, to reinforce one another. At the same time, what I've also heard is don't always use the language of crisis. Bring it down. Talk also around the manageability of some of these things. I see that in particular with the so-called refugee crisis in Europe, which should never really be called a crisis. But people that don't look at it as something that we can actually tackle in different ways. And finally, the law. Where the law is important. Understand how what has worked and what we can build on, that can continue to work, educating people at the law, and that starts with us as humanitarians. Make sure that really the people that need to know the law are well equipped, to use it on the ground, and not be remiss about changing it, as Manu was saying, when it's possible. Which brings me back to the final point around leadership. It is the leadership that we need to have the courage, to really help us with these things, which is a perfect segue for the next panel, where I hand over back to Mark. But first of all, let me join me in thanking the panel. You do want to add something?
No, it's okay.
No, okay. Bang on time. We started 10 minutes late, and I'm finishing just 4 minutes late. But thank the panel with me. This was a fantastic discussion.